We saw in 2022 that the Ukrainians were able to launch a couple of relatively lightning attacks, and that the Russian logistical and training system was so abominable that the Ukrainians were able to capture very large chunks of their territory in a matter of days. We have definitely not seen that this time. The Russians used the intervening time between October of last year and the spring of this year to put into place massive fortifications that the world has not seen since at least the Second World War. And while the casualty ratios have been horrific for the Russians have proven willing to just throw more and more and more people. Some of the estimates that are probably a little bit more realistic suggest that the Russians are losing 2 people for every Ukrainian lost. And when you're defending, that shouldn't be happening. It should be at most flipped. But the Ukrainians don't have nearly as many men to spare as the Russians do. And if the Russians keep doing these partial mobilizations where they're pulling up 100,000 or so people at a time, they can keep up this pace of carnage for at least the next 3 or 5 years. We haven't seen the breakthrough on the scale of what we saw in 2022. And until we do, and I'm not saying it will happen, but until we do see that, this sort of long grinding fight is honestly what warfare has looked like in this part of the world for most of recorded history. Let me underline a couple of things. First of all, if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, that's not the end of the war. People forget that this is the 9th post-Soviet military conflict that the Russians have initiated. This is the most famous one. Okay. And if the Russians are to get what they feel they need to rebuild their outer defensive perimeter, that includes the city of Warsaw. So if the Russians are successful here, we will have a military assault that eventually will consume 5 NATO countries. So the smart play is to stop it here, stop it firmly so that that never happens. So keep that in mind, whatever your political views are on Ukraine, Russia, and the rest. This is not the end of the story. We're only midway through the story. And then second, there is a clock that is being run out. While the Russians have a lot more men than Ukraine does, the birth rate in the Russian system collapsed back in 1992. The Russians do have a lot more men than the Ukrainians have, roughly 8 million men in their 20s. But that's the last generation. The Russian birth rate collapsed with the post-Cold War era, and this is the last generation of fighters that the Russians can bring at scale to a conflict. So once they've gone through these people, or once they reach their 30s, that is really the end of Russia's capacity to launch an offensive conflict. So if we can keep Ukraine alive and keep the military conflict sufficiently contained so no nukes fly, the end of Russia is in sight now, and we will never have to worry about anything like this ever again if we can make it that far. Well, one of the many things we've seen in the industrial era is that as people industrialize and they move into cities, they just have fewer kids. So the Russian situation is certainly kind of an outlier in terms of just how bad it is because of Soviet mismanagement and the post-Soviet collapse. I don't mean to suggest that everybody is Russia, but everyone is dealing with some version of this. Actually, I think the Russians will outlast, say, the Germans. The German birth rate collapsed almost a century ago. And a century on, this is the final decade where they're going to have enough workers to even pretend to have an industrial system. Versions of this conversation need to be had for 50 countries this decade and another 100 countries over the next 2. If you are going to have a positive demography that generates enough children to carry the system forward, your industrialization process can't be so fast and so brutal that it uproots people's lives completely. And they also have to have hope for the future.
You mean like sweeping through the countryside wholesale and forcing everyone to move into a city? Just off the top
that
of
would be a great example of what not to do.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, obviously the Russians did that. We're only now seeing the impact of Stalinization. But the Chinese did it faster. The Chinese have gone from a pre-industrial population structure as recently as the 70s to by the time we get to 2030, we will be well into an advanced post-industrial collapse. I mean, all in one human lifetime. The countries that are in the thick of it and where this is probably their last decade. China's at the top of that list, but also on that list is Italy and Korea and Germany. Right around turn of the decade, going into the first half of the following decade, then you're talking about maybe the Spanish, Thailand at the end of the 2030s. Japan's a weird one. If you had asked me back, 15 years ago, I probably would have put them in kind of the vanguard because they were the world's demographically oldest country, oldest age structure, and most rapidly aging. But over the last 35 years, they have offloaded a lot of their industrial base, which kind of insulates them from the workforce collapse. They've really focused on the knowledge economy, and they bring the money from their earnings overseas to maintain their tax base. But most of all, they've been able to bring up their birth rate bit by bit by bit. So they're still old. They haven't fixed this, but they've slowed it down. And so they're no longer in the top 10 for most rapidly aging countries. They've managed to buy themselves a little bit of time. Well, the problem is that, no, we don't have a good historical analog. Most of this is directly or indirectly an outcome of industrialization. When you're on the farm, kids are free labor. You have a whole bunch of them. When you're in the city, kids are just really expensive pets. You have fewer of them. It's just math. I mean, would you want 8 kids living in a condo? But on the farm, you want 8 kids because that way you don't have to hire anyone. The end of the Roman Empire, the last couple of centuries, there were a series of plagues that went through all of the Mediterranean and wiped out half the population. That obviously contributed to the collapse of Rome. And the second one would be the Black Plague, which gutted the middle part of the age pyramid, people in their 20s and their 30s. That changed the labor structure. And as horrific as it was, it actually set the stage for what we now recognize to be skilled labor, because all of a sudden there was a labor shortage and every little unit of labor we had to do better. And so the countries that could adapt to that did very well over the centuries. The first few decades were a hot mess for everybody. What this does to the political system in Israel, that's actually the small story. What this does to the culture of Israel is something that is going to reverberate for decades. And if you're willing to take a very cold approach to casualties, they got the skills to do it. If you want to get really cold, this has already happened 100 times in Ukraine. I mean, you basically what I just described, that was the Russian war effort for the first year, going into cities and cleansing them. The only way you get rid of opinions is to get rid of the people who have the opinions, and that's never pretty. Their industrial demographic experience is by far the most extreme that we have ever seen from any country ever. And their demographic decline now, by their own numbers, assuming their numbers are accurate, is already the most extreme in the human record. And China will cease to exist as a unified, industrialized nation state within 10 years at this point, assuming nothing goes wrong and assuming their government is very good at managing the decline. But we have seen Chairman Xi basically gut the entire system of any source of information that might prove useful to a government. And so he's now making decisions in a black box, blind. No, we are looking at national collapse within 10 years. Let me at least partially explain why this hasn't really popped up. A lot has gone down in the last 5 years. Chairman Xi has created the world's most dramatic and tight cult of personality in human history, much more than Mao ever did. So information flow just isn't there. And then we had COVID, where all the numbers were scrambled, assuming we could get them at all. So it's only really since about April of this year that we're being able to see through some of the fog. And what we're realizing is that China isn't peaking now. They're not just about to peak. It's that they actually peaked before all of this noise. And then we missed all the data revisions. We missed all the political shifts because all these other things were going on. And now we're on the backside of it. So we now know that China's population didn't peak in 2022. It probably peaked back in 2012. We now know that India didn't become the world's largest population last year. That was probably 7 years previous. We now know that Americans didn't become, on average, younger than average Chinese. That probably happened 10 years ago as well. And so we're all in the process of reassessing. And if you're one of those China bulls, to have this sort of a dramatic shift, it's only been 6 months since the data started getting kind of realized. So people will get there. My biggest concern is that the cult of personality is now so tight that they've started to not even collect certain types of data that are really baseline economic indicators. And so we might not know that we've had a hard crack in China until the product just stops arriving. Do I think China is doomed? Absolutely. Will I live out to see what's next? Absolutely. But every day China is still there. That's a gift. Because it's one more day we have to prepare for a world without Chinese manufacturers. And I would really like us to have most of this stuff, at least in the process of being up and running, before we lose access to the world's workshop.